Welcome to Nebu Academy. My name is CJ Alton, and I am the founder of the Lyfe Network, the same platform that hosts Nebu Academy. Today, we're going to be reviewing the Black Reparations Policy course. Now, what this course is going to be about is bringing reparative justice to Black folks, African Americans, melanated people, however you want to claim it. But it's going to be talking about ideas, projects, programs, legislations, and ultimately solutions to bring justice to Black folks. Now today, we're going to be reviewing a piece of legislation that is specifically has been passed in California to bring, again, reparative justice to Black folks. So with that said, let's get right to it. Now, the title of this presentation is California Assembly Bill 3121, African American Reparations Task Force. So this is the bill that was legislated in this state of California to move along with the process of bringing reparative justice to Californians. So let's get into it. So who authored the bill? Well, there was a lot of different co-authors, but the main author of the bill, the one that brought in the big idea, is Shirley N. Weber, who is currently the California Secretary of State. So she is predominantly responsible for the written material on this bill, and we'll get to that as we move along. Now, the vote for this bill, right? As you can see, the Assembly voted in favor of 72%, right? Again, in favor of this bill, as the Senate voted 82% in favor of this bill. So as you can see, the California legislature was in support for this bill to be passed. And this is important, not only to mention that voting is important, but also the simple fact, right, that it's important to vote for representatives that are going to be in support to bring reparative justice to Black folks, specifically in California. So when was this bill legislated? Well, it was legislated September 30th of 2020 by California Governor Gavin Newsom. Now, if you remember, September 2020 was a hectic time. It was a hostile time, which is why this may have gotten swept under the rug and not very many people knew about it. So it was important that we went ahead and presented this piece of information so that we can get folks aware of this bill, right? So this piece right here, what this slide shows is that all the theories and all the conspiracies and all the hypotheticals are officially over. This is something that is real, and this is something that has been going on for the last 2-3 years. So what is this bill? What's the description? Well, specifically, it establishes the task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. AB 3121 charges the California Department of Justice with providing administrative, technical, and legal assistance to the task force. So basically what this means is that the California Department of Justice is responsible for upholding this bill. And so what they did was they went ahead and created a task force, which is really just a fancy way of saying a research group, to look into the concept of reparations and slavery in America, but also in California. So to be specific, this is not the actual bill that's going to get you checks or going to get you cash. This is the bill that is simply doing research to grab hold of an understanding of why we need those checks and why we need those cash and why we need that cash, right? So we have to bring about a reasoning of reparations before we can get reparations. It's quite obvious to the average folk, but things are done in black and white. So the task force has to put a report forth. So here are some of the members of the task force. You can go ahead and take a snapshot. You can pause the video, do whatever you got to do. I don't have to read these to you specifically, but what I can tell you is that Camilla Moore is the chair of this task force, and Dr. Amos C. Brown is the vice chair of this task force. And so these are the experts that were specifically selected by government representatives to carry out this task. So again, it's important for the public, you and I together, to make sure that we hold these folks accountable for doing what they're supposed to do and bring reparative justice to Black folks, right? Because we didn't get to vote on these individuals. So we got to make sure that we apply pressure in a responsible way, right? So with that said, here are some of the key findings of the task force intern report. So the task force came out with a report this past June of 2022. It was approximately a 500-page report, and it discussed a lot of different topics that we're going to review in the coming slides. But here are just some basic key findings to, again, bringing reasoning to why Black folks in America and why Black folks in California deserve reparations, right? So number one, all level of governments in the United States of America have passed laws to preserve transatlantic slavery. So there's actual laws, right, that were preserved to have slavery and bondage continue. Human beings in chains and shackles were being basically authorized. It was legal. Secondly, physical and psychological terror have been documented in the United States during slavery and Jim Crow. So we could talk on and on about this, but as we know the basics, physical and psychological punishment and terrorism was committed against African descendants. And lastly, public and private institutions have neglected Black Californians socially, politically, and economically for over a century. So this is in regards to political disenfranchisement, not being able to vote, underfunding our schools, specifically Black and brown schools. And then, economically could be banks, not supporting Black folks and giving out loans. So specifically injustices in California, we could talk about social injustice, where California's Black and brown schools receive less funding and resources on average compared to white and Asian schools. So basically meaning white and Asian students receive more funding. And so because of that, they receive more resources, and more resources usually in turn brings more achievement within school performance. Political injustice. Police departments and the Ku Klux Klan have been documented to terrorize African Americans in California. So more specifically, the Los Angeles Police Department, the LAPD, were, coinciding with Ku Klux Klan members in Inglewood. And so some police members were actually part of the Ku Klux Klan, and they upheld a lot of the violent terrorism that went on in Inglewood. There's also history of Anaheim, California, which has been nicknamed Klanaheim, where terrorism against colored folks also would occur in the 1920s. And then lastly, economic injustice. California institutions have disenfranchised African Americans through housing segregation, also known as redlining, and hindered employment. So basically, banks, back when the New Deal had gotten started by FDR, right? Banks were handing out loans, and they were handing out loans to white folks to buy homes and so forth. But they were not handing out loans to give to Black folks. And so basically, this creates generational wealth. The middle class has been very dependent on building their wealth through housing, right? Through real estate. And so because Black folks were not being given loans, and because it was basically legal to not give Black people loans, right? This hindered their opportunity to grow wealth. And so obviously we know with the hindered employment, we'll check out some of those unemployment numbers in a minute. So here we have the 21st century repercussions in California. This is what's going on today. This is what these numbers look like today between African Americans and Caucasians. So as you can see, the poverty rate, African Americans in California are twice as much likely to be in poverty, or are twice as much to be in poverty, right? Unemployment rate is almost twice the amount. But what's interesting is the Black population in California is approximately 6%, while the Caucasian population in California is approximately 39%, almost 40%. But yet, even though Black folks have less people to employ, we still have an unemployment rate that is almost twice as much. Home ownership speaks to what I just spoke on in terms of hindered employment, right? And so because, or not hindered employment, but hindered opportunities to receive housing loans. And so this has therefore stretched the wealth gap and basically has enabled Black folks to buy homes in the last few decades. And lastly, the prison population in California. You have Black folks that make up 28% of the prison populations in California. Again, we're only 6% of the state's population, but yet we make up 28% of the prison population. That's almost 6 times greater than the residential population. As opposed to Caucasians, right? They make up again 39% of the state, but they only make up 21% of the prison population. So it's quite easy to see who's being targeted and who they want in their prison system. And it's not white folks. Now, here is the intern report by chapters, right? If you look at each chapter, you will be able to recognize that you or your family suffer from one of these things, at least. Now, I would presume it's multiple things that your family may be suffering from, whether that might be incarceration, racial terror, political disenfranchisement, so forth, so forth. But at the end of the day, we all are dealing with these things, and they have all caused harm and repercussions that have not benefited Black youth. And that is what you get from bondage and slavery and discrimination. So, what are reparations? What is reparation? Well, it's a compensation for a loss. It's a reparation for a wrong or an injury. So why do Black folks, why do African Americans, why do melanated people need reparations? Well, according to the National Institute of Health in the United States of America, they claim that 10 million plus African slaves lived in the United States between 1619 and 1865. 10 million lives were in bondage and forced to do 410 billion plus labor hours. That was essentially free of charge. They never paid these individuals for their work, and they gave their entire lives to working under financiers and so forth and so forth that have benefited and today are still benefiting from this practice of slavery. And so their wealth has grown into what you see today. So we were not paid. Our ancestors were not paid accordingly. And so in order to achieve success for us today in the 21st century, we have to be owed. We have to be paid back. Just like the Jews with the Holocaust, just like the Native Americans with the slaughter of the quote unquote pilgrims that came here, giving them smallpox, burning their villages, and also even the Japanese during World War II, where Japanese were kept in encampments, right? And against their will. And so they were paid reparations, I believe it's approximately 1988. But nonetheless, out of all those atrocities, which are very terrible, the worst atrocity of all has yet to be repaired. And that is why we're looking into this piece of legislation, to study this and bring about reparative justice. So here's a slide where I think, what are the 3 top areas of improvement for Black Californians? So this slide looks very familiar to the other slide that we saw that was in chapters, right? But I went ahead and simplified it so that you would be able to understand it a lot more simple. So what do you believe are the 3 top areas of improvement? There should be a link to take the survey. Feel free to take that survey and give your opinion. Which Black Californians deserve reparations? Is it Black Californians with proven heritage from California? Is it Black Californians residing in California for a certain length of time? All of the above, or maybe you have something else. Let us know. How should compensation be distributed? Should it be distributed to Black Californians individually as people? Should it be distributed to Black organizations and programs that are in support of the Black community? Should it go to city and county governments? Maybe it should be A and B, Black Californians individually and organizations. Or all of the above, or maybe you have another explanation. When should reparations begin to be distributed? And then lastly, what value is appropriate to pay Black Californians individually for reparations? Let us know. So we got to take action as a people, right? We got to keep the movement going. Now that we have this bill in place, it expires July of 2023. The task force is going to put out a second report and more description of what particular harms should get for reparations, right? So we got to talk about this with your family, your friends, your coworkers. You got to join monthly group discussions, which are occurring in multiple counties right now. LA has something going on with their reparative commission. San Francisco also has something going with their reparative commission. We got to be able to put forth petitions that are going to be showing a vested interest in bringing justice to Black folks. So if there's a particular company, there's a particular organization, agency that is not upholding the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and other pieces of equity legislation, then we got to be able to put forth petitions to show that we're serious about bringing equality. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, take the survey. Let your opinion be heard. If your opinion is not heard, then we have no direction. We have to form some kind of direction so that we know how to bring justice. What are you suffering from? What is your family suffering from? This is what we need to figure out. And lastly, use that link at the bottom to contact your local assembly member or senator. Apply pressure. Remember, these are the same people that voted this piece of legislation in. This piece of legislation, again, is not going to bring you cash. It's not going to bring you that check. What this piece of legislation is going to do is it's going to bring a second report from the task force in which they believe this should be reparative justice. That report is going to have solutions. And so with those solutions, your congressman or your legislature is going to have to draw from that report, create their own bill, and get it passed through the legislature and signed by the governor. So it's important that you speak to your representative in your community. Talk to them, all right? Remember, you pay them with your taxes. They work for you. So they are to do the work that you want. So always remember that. Now, when it comes to the private sector, because we talked about the public sector where governments need to repair justice and they're going to do that through the legislature. But now private entities, there are American corporations that have been involved in slavery, one way or the other, whether they benefited, profited, hired one of their predecessors that were involved, some for some way. These are just examples, but there's a longer list than this. But these are some of the prominent names that we all know and love. So it's not a matter of, pointing fingers and blaming these companies, but it is a matter of making sure that they are willing and doing everything in their power to bring reparative justice to Black folks. None of these companies that you're looking at are broke. They have money. So how are they going to utilize their finances to bring about correcting a wrong or injury, right? And repairing that for Black folks? How are they going to do that? Well, we got to apply pressure, and we got to come with them with ideas, and we got to do it in a mature manner. We can't point fingers. All right. The executives that we talked to today had nothing to do with slavery on a personal accord. But with that said, their predecessors and former executives did. So we just got to bring about a discussion, and with that discussion will come solutions. So the Lyfe Network Reparations mission, well, we want to create a learning space for youth and adults to learn their heritage, genealogy, and DNA in Southern California, and of course abroad, the rest of the state and the rest of the country. And so example of this would be California K through 12 public schools history social science curriculum has been examined to present Eurocentric narratives. So we find it feasible as a network to fund African American history and culture curricula dedicated to identifying the identity of Black African Americans. So in specific, right, what I would like to do is bring more melanated history in the classroom, present more Black history, right? So instead of, 10% of the curriculum discussing Black history and African history, let's make 90% of the curriculum discussing Black history and in African history and melanated people. And specifically, I want to do this in schools where it's predominantly Black and brown. It's only fair that students are learning about their heritage and where they come from so that they can be inspired to be somebody. That's the whole point of history, is to understand the life in which you live, understand the community in which you live in. And so with that, being able to generate some kind of motivation to be somebody, to leave a legacy behind. That is what the history portion of the curriculum is all about. So here we have Bruce Beach, which is basically Manhattan Beach, right? California, where Charles and Willa Bruce bought some land in 1912 because Black folks were not able to go to the beach. They were excluded. It was a white-only beach. So they decided to use their money to buy a part of the land that also had the beach included. But what happened was eminent domain, which is basically government taking your land because they're building, a public entity like a park or a hospital, something like that. They're able to take your land and write you a check and say, well, we need this piece of land. Here's what it's worth. There's your check. We're taking it. And so the Bruce family was not able to generate wealth for decades and decades and decades at a time until finally it was given back to the Bruce family in 2021. So yes, they lost a lot of wealth, but at the end of the day, they were able to receive something that was given to them or given to their ancestors. And so now this is just an example of reparations at its finest. We can be given back something for a wrong or an injury. So there's the sources. Take a snapshot, pause the video, do whatever you got to do, double check the work. And with that, that concludes the end of the presentation. So I hope y'all were able to learn something today. This is, again, a real piece of legislation. This is something that's very important. And we got to make sure that this is something that is possible, right? Something that we follow through with. We don't want this to just wander on by. We got to make it happen. So, with that, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. I'll see you next time. Peace and love.